Yeah.
I think, yeah, one of the things I was trying to think through also with this kind of impossible question of my project is like, what can actual users do, then especially the ones that are not technically equipped that much, or like they don't have a knowledge of protocols and stuff. So then I was thinking, okay, if user is simulated and the user has a profile and it and it exists in such sterile environment that you are a user and you has this, like, why for example we cannot start sharing one profile, or why cannot we, you know, like the anonymity becomes also something that explored within maybe like exchange of data which is not like sterile and divided. Mm-hmm. So that was some thoughts I had, and yeah, I think your example is also really great in terms of yeah, addressing like how anonymity, but also yeah, the kind of the collective approach to appropriating also the tools and mechanisms that are already at play. So like the Google Maps, like for a long time I've been a proponent of idea of like how do we appropriate which is already there. You know, if you have a GPS thing, and like, why don't you use it to your own advantage to make money? You know, like, or it doesn't have to be about making profit, but it can also be towards a value or towards maybe a different kind of benefit, which in their sense way is collective. Yeah.
Did you recognize what you did in Anastasia's story?
Totally.
Right. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I would be
luckily. I was also intrigued by your first question, our first statement, actually, that this was a project about resisting the neoliberalization of the queer identity, which is, there is no the queer identity, obviously, and that's why it's queer. But on the other hand, you do.
So many people that you could say that to, and they could learn something from that.
Okay. I'm always open to learn. But, on the other hand, you do, by putting this on the map, the Google map, you do contribute to this datification of the queer of queer identities. As I stand corrected.
No, I wasn't correct. I was just saying that is true.
Oh,
and that
okay,
there are
sorry.
many people that don't necessarily think that way.
Fine.
So it's, no.
Okay, but I'll say queer identities to be precise. Yeah. So you do kind of play a role now in the datification of queer identities. So how does, I mean, I understand that this is, well, yeah, we can call it a hack. I was actually one point that since this whole interface was open from the beginning, like the MAGA people were not actually hacking, they were just using, right?
Yeah,
they were not appropriating actually, but never mind that. So you are contributing to the datification of queer identity. So how does that sit? I mean, yes, I understand the intention, but there are different layers to it. There is something you're giving away also, which.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that's the question that I'm trying to contend with. Of when there is this desire for representation, the internet does an incredible thing in terms of allowing the proliferation of queer identities in new and different contexts. That there's obviously going to be a trade-off, and something like Queer in the Map is definitely towing that line of what is the trade-off of having access to queer stories that are often not made legible in the same way that other stories are made legible. And so trying to figure out the ways to do to accomplish that desire for visibility and the tangible work that it does in terms of keeping people alive, very frankly, with the resistance to the collection of data.
Yeah, I want to mention something that I think we'll come back to also in the other talks a little bit. So there's this, on the one hand, right now, the whole, let's say, the setup of tonight's talks, of this afternoon's talks, the fake, the disinformation campaigning and the whole political landscape that this is part of is, like the middle is abandoned. We only have now bubbles which are increasingly extreme and refer to themselves and to all the others as enemies. And at the same time, both your stories seem to address a kind of implicit mainstream position, which is then to be enriched. At the same time, so we're in a bit, somehow we're in two different, we're happening in two different stories now. At one hand, we're, let's say, calling for positioning ourselves within our own bubble and fortifying our own particular, like we're doing here, obviously. Celebrating our own variety of identities, but still within, well, I would say probably largely not disagreeing. We're very clearly in a bubble here. At the same time, we're imagining for our own, let's say, political positioning. We're imagining a mainstream that still needs to be convinced of anything, but that mainstream seems to be disappearing. That overarching narrative is no longer there. So, how does this sit with you? I mean, I wonder if there is not. There's two. I'm also referring to the talk of Louis later on a little bit, who was talking about peer-to-peer nets, which is really about basically establishing your own spaces. So not trying to imagine a mainstream, but needs to be appropriate or convinced of anything, but really just go somewhere else. And so this is also not the user position that you've been addressing. And I was thinking of the citizen as maybe the old-fashioned variety of this one, so the participant, responsible, self-creating, autonomous, let's say, having a high degree of agency type of person. Within the user frame that you're using, this seems to be more or less impossible by the definition of being part of this, the GAFA stack, the whole, the tech giants platforms. And that's the background of my question about Google Maps. So you're also addressing the mainstream at the same time. So why? Do we still believe the mainstream needs to be appropriated? Or
a lot of questions.
So it was a long, actually only one question, but that is a long introduction.
Okay,
so
I will try to.
The question is, does the mainstream need to be appropriated, or why not create our own spaces? That's the question.
Yeah, well, of course, yeah, this is a really important question. How do you, even if you decide to appropriate something that's more maybe accessible in terms of even just interfaces, because a lot of own spaces, what we call, are also quite technical, I would say. So in a way that are less, they may seem to be a bit more obscure and less handy. And if we talk about like maybe addressing the people who, like not the mainstream, because I don't think the mainstream exists, but even if I actually addressing someone like our parents, which I also have tried with my project, and then I discovered that my dad is actually the perfect example of this kind of quantified self-movement. So he tracks literally everything, he publishes everything online, and he has all these devices that allow him to be kind of the super, create a lot of data. And then I tried to explain to him that this is not empowering in some way, but actually he loses something. And then it was very, very difficult. But then a bit unrelated to that is that I think they're using the mainstream, let's say, platforms, and also why I'll come back to kind of reappropriation of thinking of, okay, maybe it's for the, maybe it's not even effective, because anyway you contribute to the same system, and anyway you are probably don't have much impact on an individual level, but and now it only has, or mainly has, a value on kind of having a narrative, or like creating a story. So like this kind of project that I show, they're quite funny, but then what they actually try to do is to create a narrative that could be more accessible, basically. So more like easily understood, also by my dad, who would like maybe understand the Google Map thing, but then he would never use a open source map just because it's way too complicated and his friends are not on it. So I get it.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about like reframing the mainstream as not something, because inevitably the articulation of something, the articulation of queerness, always will bring it into the mainstream. There's always like, we can never exist outside of capitalism, sadly, that's probably the truth. But there's still the necessity to make those kinds of changes. And so something like, I mean, for example, like what is happening on Queer in the Map in terms of the urgency of the things that people are sharing. And I also have to say, in terms of like, Queer in the Map was not set up for, in terms of thinking about like imagining a different world. I very much imagine Queer in the Map as a different world, but I think there would be a problematic in shutting that world off too, because in shutting that off, it would be like, one of the questions that came up when we were recoding the website was like, should there be a CAPTCHA system that's like designed for queer people? But then that falls into the same traps as like, who are the winners of RuPaul's Drag Race? And so there's like a problematic in trying to make that divide. And then I think there's also value in not necessarily appealing to the mainstream, but relating to or being or allowing for relation to the mainstream in terms of, and specifically something like through anonymity. I'm sure there are a lot of people that in their real life don't identify as queer because of the sort of way that queerness has become this like monolithic to a certain extent, like anti-identity, that are then able to articulate queerness, and that relationship to the collective queer allows people to inhabit that kind of politic. Of course, that also allows for it to become part of the neoliberal machine, but I think it also animates the more radical potential or disruptive potential of queerness.
So this, even though those platforms, I mean, at the same time, they represent a, let's say, normalizing, in the violent sense, a normalizing tendency, normalized technologies, protocol logic power. This is how you do it. There's no other way. At the same time, these powers, these platforms offer all these different kinds of identities to exist at the same time. So at the same time, this is what breaks society apart right now as we speak. This is why we're talking about. So maybe, I'm not sure if I should ask you this question, but maybe to think about it, to revisit later after the other talk. So is there a way to reconcile these positions? So I agree that mainstream is not the right word. I mean, the whole word does not, belongs to mass media in a way. It does not belong to the new media at all. So it's a bit of a complicated term, but is there a way to reconcile this resistant user positions, this citizen-driven create world building, I would call it, generating other worlds rather than just carefully inhabiting the one that's violently rolled over us? Is there a way to reconcile the current stack world with the resistant world building without separating off? So I want to leave you with that question, unless you have a. Actually, it's my question also, and it's, I guess, everybody's question to some extent. Like, should we really try to kind of break off and do our own things elsewhere, or should we still try to save this world one way or another? Yeah.